You are experiencing the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast.
It is June 5th, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we're bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the country and in your region. And today we have a special guest with us. We have ter Maat. He is a candidate for the 2024 Libertarian Party nomination for the U.S. president. And so this is part of a series we're doing to try and help you get to know what the candidates think and what the values they're really pushing out there. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. In our lower left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in Liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. My name is Jason McPhee. I'll be your host. And in our right-hand corner, we have ter Maat with us. So, Mike, you want to tell us?
It's great to be with you.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. We're so grateful to have you here. So, Mike, did you want to start telling us a little bit about your campaign and maybe how you decided that, this is something you needed to do to make a difference for liberty?
Sure. I appreciate that. Those two questions actually go hand in hand for me. The reason I'm in this is because I believe that it's important for us to guide the Libertarian Party in a particular direction. I think that all of us understand we have a huge opportunity in 2024 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that the other parties are an abject mess, and that themselves for a couple of different reasons. I believe that to take advantage of that, we need to run a very, very professional campaign. I already have a team of people in place. We have as of today, we have 12 professionals on our staff, and very excited to be rolling out new elements of our program every day. We also believe that we need to run a campaign that is policy forward. We believe that the way to differentiate us from Republicans and Democrats is to lead with policy, importantly, focused on tried and true libertarian principles, to define ourselves in our own context and by those principles. So I've collected what we call the Gold New Deal.
And just before you get too far into that, James, Can you bring up the visual here so we can show people Mike's page? Here's Mike's page. It is ter.com, and here is his page for the Gold New Deal. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, you can go to ter.com. You can go to goldnewdeal.org. Gold New Deal is what we call our platform. It's a collection of the most transformational ideas because we believe that we need to fundamentally change the relationship between citizens and the government, especially between individuals and the federal government, but also between states and the federal government. So we talk a lot about reforming that relationship. For example, getting rid of certain agencies, sunsetting the IRS, sunsetting the Federal Reserve System. As an economist, you might imagine I spend a lot of time talking about monetary policy and the importance of getting rid of Fed discretion over monetary policy and replacing it with a rules-based system. So we talk a lot about these transformational ideas changing our fundamental relationship with government. And that's what our campaign is all about. Leading with policy, differentiating from the other parties, and doing so in a very sophisticated, professional, and credible way.
Could you expand a little bit on the abolishing the Federal Reserve and its replacement?
Yes, absolutely. I've spent a lot of time working with the Fed. I was never a Fed employee, but I did work for the White House for a couple of years. I worked with other agencies. I was an advocate for free markets in the banking industry for many, many years. And later on, as an entrepreneur, I was in the business of educating financial services professionals and providing consulting services to some important financial institutions. So I've been in and around the Fed a great deal. I've met with the Fed board in the boardroom itself. I've had my research on the banking industry publicly cited by the Federal Reserve chairman when that chairman was Alan Greenspan, going back to the bad old days. So I have every respect and admiration for the efforts and the talents of the economists that are employed by the Federal Reserve System. But I think it's clear after this 100-year experiment that the Fed is just institutionally unable to live up to what it is that we ask of it. So I believe that we need to break the Fed into its natural components and individually sunset each one. And that starts out with recognizing that we need to replace Fed monetary policy itself with a rules-based system. You know, we can all, as libertarians, we're all used to having fights among each other. So I'm welcome to have an argument about what that set of rules should be. But my favorite is to leverage Milton Friedman's idea of a fixed growth rate for money supply each year, and to commit to that fixed rate of increase in a way that would not allow discretion to individuals. So that would take, the first step would be replacing the leadership of the Fed with individuals who are committed to a rules-based system. And then the second step would be getting rid of the Fed balance sheet and transferring it to the Treasury Department and making it subject to legislation. That would not be a silver bullet in the sense that the legislature of the federal government still has the ability to do some pretty profoundly stupid things, but it would end this idea of midnight bailouts and Fed complete discretion over bailing out institutions and backing up deposits and just, you know, willy-nilly undermining the good behavior in our banking system and elsewhere in corporate America, by the way. And the third step is to change the way Fed regulation is promulgated. I would make it completely optional. Today, it's mostly optional. Banks don't have to be regulated by the Fed. It's hard to operate without the Fed system if you're a commercial bank, but you don't need to be regulated by the Fed. I would make it completely optional in the sense that you wouldn't have to be regulated at all if you didn't want to, if you were a commercial bank, or you could choose a state regulator or the Treasury Department, as you could now, or the FDIC. Most banks would choose to have a regulator because they believe they need some good housekeeping seal of approval. But I do think that that could be handled in the private sector and probably more effectively. So in that sense, I would get rid of all three of the functions of the Federal Reserve, and then you'd be able to move legislation to get rid of the institution completely. Of course, one of the big threats from the Fed these days is happening very, very fast. This summer, they're rolling out a central bank digital currency on a wholesale basis. And I do believe that in the next year or two, they will be trying to roll it out on a retail basis. And that's very dangerous. And not only because it could be a window for the federal government into every transaction that we conduct, that would be bad enough and potentially horrific. But just as problematic, I believe, is the fact that it would interfere with the development of the way these markets should go in the future. We're paused right on the edge of a real inflection point in the development of our economy toward the reliance on smart contracting, contracts that'll run on blockchain technology. That's going to require markets to develop in a sophisticated way that the Fed, nor the rest of us, will be unable to predict. And I'm afraid that the Fed will bias the development of these technologies toward its own currency, of course, and institute regulations that make it difficult for the marketplace to decide how these technologies and how these cryptocurrencies should evolve. So it's very, very important that we need to keep the Fed out of these areas. So the faster we can get rid of the Federal Reserve System, the better.
As to the
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So as to the FDIC, would that be one of the agencies that you would definitely get rid of?
I think the FDIC needs to be completely privatized as opposed to just sunset. The banking industry needs to decide whether or not they want to collectively pool an insurance fund to protect themselves or not. I believe that many commercial banks would opt out of having a commercial bank charter that's tied to the federal government, requires them to pay premiums to the FDIC, requires them to accept insurance on deposits from the FDIC. Some banks, I think, like that model, and with a privatized FDIC, they could continue to pursue it if they chose to do so. But I believe that many banks would choose to go without that model, or go with a similar model but without the FDIC and choose to pool up a different insurance fund to protect themselves and possibly have completely different rules. But there's no reason why the FDIC should be the FDIC instead of just some deposit insurance corporation.
True. Okay.
Well, Mike, it sounds like, to kind of summarize on the bank thing, that you know, because one of the things we constantly hear in the libertarian movement is end the Fed. That's certainly common.
I talk a lot about ending the Fed. That's right.
Sure.
But I have a plan to do so. I know how complicated it is, and I know how important it is.
Okay, but I guess in talking about Milton Friedman's plan, and maybe it sounds like then you're looking for a stepwise process to get there, and not just simply, you know, yanking the tablecloth out from everything all at once, I guess.
Well, the way I would characterize it is to split it into 3 or 4 parts and go after each part separately. It's a two-step process in the sense that you have to replace the leadership first. Let people get used to the idea of there being a rules-based system in place and see that it can work successfully, and then you can get rid of the Fed system. You're right. If you were to yank the rug out from underneath the Fed in one moment and just impose a rule for monetary expansion, I'm afraid that the markets would feel that it was 2 steps taken at one bite, and they would be unsure of how well it would play out. And so in that sense, I don't think that I personally need for it to go in 2 steps, but I think it would reassure the markets that we were on a thoughtful glide path. And so I would advocate to do it in 2 steps. By the way, it would be politically easier to do it in 2 steps as well. You cannot get rid of an agency in Washington, or even a function in Washington, until you get it under control and make it politically less dominant. So in that sense, you know, the Fed is a very, very powerful political organization operating in Washington, D.C. And by replacing the leadership with individuals that were committed to a rules-based system instead of complete discretion over monetary policy, you would get that under control right away.
Yeah, it seems like it's sort of the crack dispenser of our government.
Yeah,
sort of that it keeps the whole system high as a kite and ready to crash. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I wanted to transition off of this thing so we have enough time to talk about some of your other topics too. But you mentioned that you were in the White House working with the Fed. Which administration was that with, and how did you transition to Liberty from there? I mean, what sort of rang your Liberty bell and woke you up to some of these ideas?
Well, I was always on the free market side of things. I grew up as a conservative economist. I was teasing Leon earlier. I studied as an engineer in school, and as Leon, I'm sure, has discovered, the transition from engineering to economics is actually pretty smooth. The equation systems all work the same. You just replace the names of the variables. Indeed. So I went to business school immediately out of engineering school, went to work for a couple of banks, and then later on went to graduate school in Washington at the George Washington University. I was very lucky to be in a pro-market environment in grad school. GW is one of the leading, still is one of the leading universities that pushes the idea of free markets in economics. So I got lucky there. I went to work for the White House and for a couple of other agencies. I worked for a couple multilateral agencies before going to work again inside the banking industry as an advocate for free markets. And then later on, as I mentioned, as an entrepreneur. As a conservative free market economist, I would say that I was coming at libertarianism. In those days, I was a registered Republican. I was coming at libertarianism from what I would call the right-hand side, the efficiency side, the side that recognizes that we're all better off with economic decisions being made by individuals, sort of that Hayekian concept, right? And you get pretty disappointed if you're a Republican in the 80s and the 90s, in the sense that the Republican Party was coming away from fiscal conservatism. the White House that I worked for was under George Herbert Walker Bush. I was civil service, so he was my boss's 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 boss. So it wasn't like I was giving him advice in the Oval Office every day, right? My job was inside the Office of Management and Budget. I was helping the rest of the agency stay in compliance with budget control law. In those days, we had budget control law. These days, it's not even effective. It's a complete afterthought. But in those days, we took that kind of thing very seriously. And of course, he was the president who had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes."
Yes.
And he came off of that pledge. It was a huge disappointment to any number of Republicans. You don't have to be a libertarian to have been disappointed by that statement. But it wasn't until quite a few years later that I came to libertarianism from what I would call the left-hand side, which is to say the ethical side of defending individual liberty, irrespective of economic efficiency. And so the example that I always point out is, imagine a world in which socialism worked, which is a funny thing, I think, for a libertarian to say in a Monday morning.
Yes.
Use your imagination and imagine that socialism, was a good idea, that efficiency-wise, that the government really was able to make better decisions for us than we were able to make ourselves. Just use your imagination for that for a minute. There are still plenty of people around the world who believe this to be true, by the way, which is, as an empirical matter, I find really strange. It's darn near akin to believing the earth is flat at this point after looking at the performance of socialistic institutions over the past century. Yes. But never mind all that. The left-hand side of libertarianism says, to me, in my mind, it says that even if that were true, that the government could make better decisions for you, it wouldn't matter. That you still have the right to make decisions for yourself. You have the right to live your life by your own standards, that you deserve to have your individual liberty protected, that the government has no business interfering in your life, the life of your community, irrespective of who thinks what might be a good idea. And that was something that I began to appreciate in the early 2000s. I became a police officer in 2010. I worked as a cop on the road for 11 and a half years in Broward County, Florida, at the south end of Broward County, in a fairly, let's just say, busy area for police work in Florida. And that was a great experience. But that experience was completely as a registered libertarian, which, as you might imagine, leads to a whole host of thoughts about how to manage police officers and align our criminal justice system with our community's underlying values. There's a different way of looking at it from a libertarian point of view.
Yeah. Well, that certainly sounds, like some necessary insights to our current, White House, because, not only the idea of being tied into the whole monetary system and understanding, these market mechanisms, but also to understanding, the law enforcement, which is really kind of a sore spot recently, with the way that they kind of abandoned property rights almost in a lot of these situations. And
the idea of civil asset forfeiture is really a shame. It's a really hardcore example of how the government has come to completely disregard property rights, to your point. Obviously, that has to be ended, but there's any number of other things that we talk about in terms of criminal justice reform that are important as well.
Yeah.
I think the Supreme Court just recently had a case involving a woman, I believe in Minnesota, where they have kind of pulled back on pushback against the government. And
we're making inroad. We're making progress.
Yes.
So often is the case, however, I worked in the state of Florida. I live in Virginia now, but I worked in Florida for 11 and a half years. And you were able to separate someone's property from them and then go to court later. You could get the court to back you up and you wouldn't have to have anyone convicted of a crime. It's really an evil system.
Yes.
It's really unconstitutional. I was fortunate not to have been involved with the groups that engaged in this behavior. I was not a drug cop or a vice cop, which is where most of this takes place. But as you might imagine, as a libertarian, you get into some pretty interesting conversations with your fellow officers about fundamental constitutional right versus wrong types of issues.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I do find that most cops have a very strong libertarian streak. Most of them are registered Republicans, of course. But as we all know, we all love to be mad at our boss, right? We all love to recognize that our boss can be an idiot sometimes. Well, imagine if you're a cop, how that plays out, right? You can't believe the stupid things the legislature wants me to enforce these days. You can't imagine the stupid things that our city or our county or our state is trying to impose. And so there are naturally plenty of times when a cop's libertarian streak comes out, if for no reason than recognizing that the state can be full of crap from time to time. But, the other thing that I found is that, and this, I have to admit, surprised me when I became a cop, is the enormous amount of discretion and latitude the police officers have over any particular situation. And of course, this is what leads to potentially very bad things happening sometimes, as we've all witnessed because of the ubiquity of cameras these days, right? The past couple of decades, especially.
Yes.
But it's also what confirms in each police officer, certainly once you're past your rookie and second year, that holy cow, it's up to me to protect individual rights and not just protect them from bad guys, which of course is typically a big motivating factor for people wanting to become police officers, is to protect people from crime. But you quickly realize you need to protect them from the government as well.
True. True.
That includes things like the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. But, oh my goodness, it also includes protecting them from some of the dumb things that your town wants to do in terms of enforcement. So it's a real learning experience, that's for sure.
Yeah, we certainly see sheriffs appear to be almost the front line of resisting some of these unconstitutional grabs of power that seem to be happening from these legislatures. But it's disheartening in a place like California, where we're out of. We see this focus on, I guess, a complete abandonment of, I guess, people's private property rights when you talk about it, just leaving people to fend for themselves in terms of, small crime that can often turn into violent crime. And when people are just walking into stores and grabbing things, and gosh, it just seems, and then of course there's this terrible focus on, on a more national level about what goes into your body, policing that, and in a lot of jurisdictions, maybe the government are the biggest thugs in taking from people.
It's backwards, isn't it?
Yes,
we need to get rid of the war on drugs. I think that most cops at this point, I don't have statistics to back me up, but anecdotally, it seems to me that if not most, certainly a large plurality of police officers recognize that the war on drugs doesn't work. Never mind for a moment the ethics of it, right? Set that aside just for a moment. Just empirically speaking, it doesn't work. The government is unable to shut down drug use. It's unable to stop people from conducting transactions. This is what creates black markets. Black markets come from a government deciding to criminalize something that the culture is not ready to give up. Yeah. Every cop knows how dangerous black markets are. And black markets in the drug trade are the most dangerous of all. This is where violent gang activity comes from. So for this reason, however you feel about the ethics of drug use, however you feel about the ethics of the government stepping in and playing a role in that, it doesn't work. the black markets are objectively, arguably more dangerous than the underlying drug markets themselves.
Yeah.
And it's not just the violence that comes with that, but the reason we see so many fentanyl-related deaths is because there's not the reliability that you see in markets that are out in the open in terms of reporting, revealing what is in these various drugs, testing, trusted authorities, trusted agents, trusted providers. All of that goes away in a black market environment, and that's why it's so dangerous.
Well, and these are some of the counterintuitive ideas that are so hard to reach the public with when they think of this command and control. And I guess we're starting to get short on time. What do you see as the biggest challenge in reaching people with these libertarian ideas as you're running for president? And as we wrap up, what are some of the final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with as well?
Sure. I mean, you're right. It is a challenge, but I would hasten to add that there's a huge opportunity for us. I think that Americans are increasingly cognizant of the fact that a lot of our problems come from bad public policy. I think that people recognize in a way that is new and accelerating that, for example, inflation doesn't just grow on a tree. It comes from bad Fed policy.
Mhm.
Our economy doesn't look all that different than it did in the 70s and the 80s, but people recognize that the underlying problems are so often driven by the government itself. So in that sense, there's a big opportunity. As another example, I think that most Republicans and Democrats are open to an anti-war message as they have never been before. I would hate to have to make the counter argument that war works for the United States. There really aren't examples that Americans would point to and say, yeah, it cost us a whole lot of billions of dollars and thousands of lives, or hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan. But it was a good idea anyway. There just aren't those examples. And so I think people are ready to hear our message, not only because of the policies that we're leading with, but because the parties themselves are messed up. Objectively speaking, Republicans are frustrated with Donald Trump and much of the rest of their leadership. Democrats are frustrated with the idea of being represented by Joe Biden again. Mm-hmm. These are opportunities for us. The increasing authoritarianism that we see coming from our federal government, as horrific as it is for the American public. And what a great example we saw through the COVID regime. So people are more familiar with these ideas than ever before. As horrific as it has been for the American public, it does, unfortunately, present an opportunity for the party that is out there representing liberty.
Well, and unfortunately, we're just about out of time here, and we're going to be talking more with Mike ter Maat about the specific issues on another show. So look for that online. But thanks so much, Mike, for talking with us on these topics, and thanks so much for joining us, and to you as an audience out there as well. Thank you for joining us as well. And until next time, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at Knuckleheads of